The public broadcaster has announced that it will go ahead with retrenchments, which could potentially affect more than 400 full-time employees. The South African Broadcasting Corporation says this is to ensure the entity's sustainability after numerous years of financial turbulence. But the SABC has indicated there are around 170 vacancies that employees can apply for, cutting down the number of employees that will be impacted to 213. To unpack this further, I'm joined now by Newzroom Afrika Director William Bird. William, a pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon. Taking a look at the process unfolding at the SABC, would you say there's another measure to avoid cutting jobs in this regard?
Hi, good afternoon. Well, to be honest, everyone hates retrenchments. They're something that you have to try and avoid at all costs. And to the extent that you've got active unions within the SABC and various other measures, it would appear that they've taken a number of steps to try and make sure that they can limit that damage as far as possible. So it's not as though they've just said, okay, retrenchments is our first order of business. From what I understand, they've put in place a number of measures, including salary freezes for the next 3 years and these kinds of things to try and rein in costs, and that despite those measures and various others that we do know about, they've got down to that number. Now, if you think back about a year, maybe 2 years ago, you would see that the original figure that was put out was at least double. They were talking about 900 people. So to get it down to this number says that they've moved quite some way and that they've been trying to make some other amends. So in as much as it's an awful thing for any entity to go through, and particularly those impacted, it doesn't appear that they have really much choice. When your costs are that high for your employees, something like 40%, it's just not a sustainable business.
Yeah. So looking at this announcement that was made about these plans to cut about 400 jobs, I'm sure you'd agree that this not only is worrying for SABC staff, but it also may have a ripple effect just looking at the entire industry.
Well, we know that, in fact, the SABC is late to the party with regard to retrenchment. Almost every other major media house, in fact, I'm struggling to think of one, hasn't in fact already gone through extensive retrenchment programs. Over the last couple of years, we've seen major newsrooms radically reducing and cutting the number of staff that are there and making sure that things tick over. So, to that extent, the SABC has withheld possibly as long as it could, and some may argue perhaps far too long.
What does this tell us about the state of the media industry? Do we expect things to get worse?
Sadly, I think that yes, things are still going to continue to get worse for our media sector. It's not as though the economy is picking up. It's not as though that many of them have been finding alternative means of revenue generation. There are some very bright, shiny lights in there. Newzroom Afrika is one of those, for an example, that is offering something quite different and for all intents and purposes appears to be doing pretty well. You've got entities like Daily Maverick that are doing well, that are expanding. In fact, just a couple of months ago, they launched a print offering. So it's not as though there are no models that are doing well, but certainly the general trend still is for media sustainability to be profoundly under deep threat. And part of that is about the fact that we have to say we need to find better ways of funding our journalism. It's not as though it's just there for one element of democracy. It fulfills a vital role for the functioning of our country, full stop.
Yeah. I now want us to focus or shine the spotlight on the problems that have been facing the ANC over the years. I mean, the problems plaguing the entity have been well documented and are in the public domain. But in your view, what has brought the SABC to the state that it's in right now?
So the SABC now is in comparatively a significantly better state than it's been in for the last nearly 2 decades. You were correct. The SABC has, until this last board, pretty much been defined by it being used as a political plaything, a place to dump fools, idiots, lunatics, and and people who are there to pursue any agenda other than that of a public broadcaster. It really has been an astonishing example of just how you can almost destroy an entity, and while the country had money, the bailouts could fly thick and fast, just not quite to the same extent as SAA, but certainly, you saw equal levels of gross mismanagement, and you saw really the low point, I think, in 2016 under Hlaudi Motsoeneng, where the SABC was almost brought to its knees. And what we've seen over the last couple of years has been a significant stabilization. We've seen the SABC radically increasing and improving its ability to deliver its news that is credible and accurate and fair. And let me tell you, that for an entity that was, suffering overt censorship is really a significant step. They've got new editorial policies that are absolutely world class. We've seen a whole range of things that are happening. They're talking about shifting to digital, and they're not just talking about it, they're actually implementing. So from that perspective, the SABC, yes, it's in dire financial strait, but had we not had COVID, perhaps it wouldn't have been quite as dire, and certainly that was the economic projection that we saw earlier in the year. So I think that in as much as they're in a difficult position now, they have been demonstrating a real and meaningful commitment to growing and doing something different. I mean, if you look at the fact that they've stood up to the Minister of Communication and to the ANC on a number of occasions, if you can't think of a single other entity that's got a tight rein around it as a public entity where they've done that. Every time Eskom tries to do that, the people move on or get fired. It happened at SA Post Office. It's happened at SAA more times than you and I change our underwear in an average year.
You seem to speak quite positively about the efforts of the new board to turn things around, but are you really confident that they have what it takes to really turn things around at the public broadcaster?
Well, look, I mean, all of these things, turning an institution that size and of that importance to, from something that was being run into the ground deliberately into, a modern digital entity is going to take a miraculous effort, let's be clear. But the steps that they've taken, the steps that senior execs and of course the most important, the employees have taken to really start to make sure that they are producing, quality news programming, those things are absolutely critical, So to that extent, I think, yes, we have more reason to be optimistic about our public broadcaster than we have at any stage since we've become a democracy.
So now let's take a look at efforts to counter against or fight off these plans to cut jobs. If you look at a union like Bemausa, they are threatening to lodge legal action if the SABC actually continues with plans to cut jobs. What's your observation on that regard?
It's really interesting because, of course, our labor laws are among the most, depending on your political view, some of the most progressive anywhere in the world. It really isn't an easy thing to retrench people. To do that, you have to follow a huge number of processes and make sure that you get them right. And one of the critical roles of a union, of any union, must be to put the best interests of their workers forward. To that extent, they need to do their job and make sure that they do that. To the extent that the SABC board needs to make sure the organization runs efficiently, they need to do that. As civil society, we're there to say from the outside, hey, both of you need to make sure that whatever happens at the end of this, you're acting actually in the public interest, because ultimately that's what matters more.
But in your assessment, can jobs really be saved at the public broadcaster?
Well, they've already been saving quite a number of them, and they've put into place a number of these other elements. As I've said, we have to wait and see and see what happens with the legal challenges, and those processes need to go forward as they would in any other due process scenario. What we do know, though, is that the way the SABC was operating was simply, it was antiquated, it was unsustainable, and it was, on many levels beggared belief. They had things like 36 leave days a year or something crazy, whereas, almost every other person in the country has to work on 28. And those are the kinds of things that you can do. You could cash in leave days. You could do. So there were a number of things that really needed to be done in order to make sure that the SABC can start to run in a more modern and efficient manner. So in as much as we can celebrate its shift from a state broadcaster to a public broadcaster in the early 90s, what it has failed abjectly to do in that interim period until these last couple of years was to start to see the trends of where things are going. You know, they didn't until the longest time, until 2 years ago, they weren't speaking about digital, you know, which is completely crazy. Now they are talking about these things. So, you know, we have to see what a new broadcaster is going to look like. And in fairness to them, it's not as though what's happening to them is unique. Public broadcasters around the world, in some of the most well-resourced countries in the UK, in the Scandinavian nations, are going through very much similar issues about how they shift and move from a public broadcaster understood to be this megalith of everything and of people and programming to being something that has to respond to the likes of Netflix and YouTube and other social media challenges, you know. So to that extent, there's nothing unusual. So does that mean that their structure is going to have to change dramatically? You know, I can't see them wanting to survive and their structure not changing dramatically.
And just lastly, speaking about that competition with the likes of Netflix, should the SABC be considering going for these subscription-based options as well, or the model similar to those of Netflix?
So look, they can't be a subscription service because they're a free-to-air broadcaster. Ultimately, we need to make sure that everyone, at minimum, has access to the public broadcaster's content and services. To that extent, though, we need to say, well, we do need better ways of funding the SABC. So some of these things have been put forward in that draft white paper. You know, and we need to find better ways of raising revenue for the public broadcaster, and certainly public funding that is arm's length. In other words, you don't want any minister being able to threaten to withhold the purse strings in order to control the SABC. So you do need better ways of raising revenue for the public broadcaster. But you know, if we're going to be a democracy, that's one of the things that we have to build into the cost of running a democracy is you need a sustainable, credible public broadcaster in just the same way as you need entities like Newzroom Afrika. Without them, your chances of being able to have a democracy are dramatically reduced.